Welcome into another episode of the News4JAGs podcast. I'm Jamal St here alongside Justin Barney. All right, we're counting down to draft day. We're starting to kind of build up that momentum towards it. We're officially going to be doing a live Jaguars draft special on Channel 4 on draft day, Thursday, April 27th from 7 o'clock to 8 o'clock. We will be live on Channel 4, and then from 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock, we'll be live on the News4JAGs Plus app and News4JAGs.com as the draft kind of starts. So a lot of fun stuff going on as we kind of start to build that momentum and get that energy rolling towards the draft.
Yeah, you know, when the Jags sent out the draft party information last week, it's kind of officially kicking it off. I mean, draft party is right around the corner. For T-minus 2 weeks, under 2 weeks and counting for that, it's going to be an exciting time. And I know we've touched on it before, but it is going to be different. It's going to be a different draft. I mean, the last two drafts, they picked one. They haven't had to wait long. You wait 15 minutes. After that show starts, you know who you've got.
Yeah.
Trevor Lawrence, Trayvon Walker. Who's going to be at number 24 this year? And, you know, it feels like every time Jacksonville has that latter half of the first round, it's a pick that leaves a lot to be desired. I keep going back to Taven Bryan and that pick, and after that run to the AFC Championship.
Well, it's because they haven't had one late since Taven Bryan. I mean, that's the last
They haven't
line.
had one since Taven Bryan. But hopefully a good 24th pick, but it's different this year.
We'll keep our eyes on it, and we'll talk more draft here in a second. Before we get to that, I want to talk to the one thing in the offseason that starts before the draft, and that's voluntary workouts. So that's phase one of the NFL offseason program. For the Jaguars last year, it was Doug Peterson's first year with the team, and they had almost 100% participation with every phase of the offseason. Yep. And I think that took a big step forward for them in helping to build the culture to what it was, where like late in the season they never flinched, because those guys had been together for so long, had seen the hard work from one another that they had put in the summer, in the heat in Florida.
We've been out in that heat quite a bit, and it drained us pretty
It's
pretty
draining,
bad.
it's intense, it gets there. So the one thing that I kind of want to see this year is if they can keep the number near that 100% mark, even though Doug Peterson's now going into year two. Some of the guys don't necessarily feel the added pressure of needing to make a good impression on the new coach, right?
I remember last year, it was during workouts, and Doug actually, he could have had him a little bit longer than he did, and he gave him a little bit of a break for OTA.
Mini camp.
So I thought that was, you know, you and I talked about that specifically, and was that a good idea? Yep. It turned out to be a darn good idea, and I think you're going to see Jacksonville have a good representation at voluntary workouts. So, you know, with the NFLPA now, it's a little bit more, hey, these are voluntary. You do not have to go, but coaches are try to maybe stress the involuntary portion as much as they can. But I thought it was good. I think Jacksonville players will respond. I think they're going to have a good attendance at that camp. You want to keep that momentum going. It just feels different in town. It feels different with this team under Doug Peterson. It's like they want to be a part of that situation and going forward. And you know, you've seen that with free agents, you know, even talking about, hey, I want to come play with Trevor in Jacksonville. Doug Peterson's got something going. So I think that conveys to that attendance in those voluntary workouts.
So keep in mind, it's voluntary workouts, then it's organized team activities or OTAs, and then there's minicamp. Minicamp is mandatory. But last year, Doug Peterson didn't make it mandatory for his veterans. That was his choice. I think one thing that we now at least know about Doug Peterson with the way he kind of approaches these phases of the offseason is that maybe we can use his approach to how the team handles things to understand where he at least kind of views his team. Last year, he felt like they had worked so hard early on. He had seen enough, had that good feeling. I think he told us at one point late in the year that he had a really good feeling about the team heading into that, and that he thought that they had a real chance to make a playoff run. Didn't tell anyone that publicly, of course, but you know, he that was part of that influence to not have them involved in that. So we'll see, and I think we can use that to gather some hints as to how he feels about the team.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head there. And you know, last year we were talking about, did Doug make the right call? This is a team that was terrible last year, 3-14. You've got to set some culture, and you're giving guys time off during OTAs. It just didn't make sense to me, but he had a good vibe, he had a good read, and I'm sure the players appreciated that. And again, it feels like a genuine type of locker room. Doug Peterson, after games last year, he's hugging players, and just that excitement, and being in the hallway after that win over the Tennessee, and that to get into that game, and then seeing Doug Peterson in the hallway with Trent Baalke after that Chargers win. It was just euphoric, and it feels, again, those aren't going to happen every game, but it's just that authenticity. And I think with Doug Peterson, what he brought as authenticity, Urban Meyer was the antithesis of that. He was not authentic. He was a shyster, a used car salesman. And Doug Peterson is authentic, and I think you saw that starting last year in those OTAs and the voluntary minicamp.
And this team kind of has been built in Doug's kind of personality image. All these guys really do genuinely like each other. We asked Trevor Lawrence about voluntary workouts after he threw out the first pitch at the Jumbo Shrimp game. He mentioned that he was excited to get back out there and work with the guys, and that's really the first time that the team kind of gets together again since the end of last season. So it'll be interesting to see just what sort of percentage they get. I think it'll be very high participation rate for this team, just because, especially with the expectations and the momentum they kind of have going. A lot of the leaders on this roster will be there and will be pushing other guys.
And if you're, if you're not at the voluntary mini camps, I mean, sure, Trevor's not going to be texting you, hey, bro, where you at?
Yeah.
I think the players, again, hold each other accountable. And, that locker room seems very, very tight-knit, very strong. And, again, Trevor Lawrence is at the front of that. And can you imagine if Calvin Ridley or somebody did not show up to that camp?
Right.
Hey, bud, where you at? And that's going to be a little bit more stern. You want your colleagues and your teammates to appreciate you and respect you. And again, I think that is what is different in this locker room than going back a few years to the Doug Marone years.
All right, so let's switch gears a little bit to the draft now. We've kind of been dedicating some of our last few podcasts to the draft talk because that's the big thing right now. I mean, when you look at the Jaguars offseason, the biggest place for them to have a chance to improve is at that spot at 24 in the first round. And the one thing that we do know about the Jaguars is that there are holes on the roster and they need a little bit of a young influence. Right. And we have to wait to find out who they're going to get. In the years past, it always kind of come down to like one or two guys for the past few years because it was like it is Trevor Lawrence or else they do something crazy and we say the Jaguars lost their minds. Or last year, it was Trayvon Walker or pretty much Aiden Hutchinson, Evan Neal. Those were really the three guys. Kayvon Thibodeau was a guy I liked. So maybe three guys, though, that were probably closely grouped for that pick. So we only had to talk about like three of them. This year, we kind of got to talk about a lot of guys because you never know. Some guy could slip down and fall all the way to 24, and then the Jaguars are just sitting there like, okay, here we go. And so we have to be prepared for that. There are a lot of different scenarios that could happen. A new mock draft came out from ESPN today. Mel Kiper, who's been doing draft coverage forever. I mean, he's kind of, the guy or one of the guys. Today, his new mock draft that he came out with is a 2-round mock draft. He had the Jaguars going in the first round, Lucas Van Ness, an Iowa defensive end, pass rusher. And let's talk about him before we kind of dive farther dive to that second round pick. I like what Mel Kiper did here. He bolsters the Jaguars defense in the first 2 rounds. So Lucas Van Ness, here's the interesting bit from him. Never started a game at Iowa. 0. Because Iowa really preferences those older players, and because he can't, if you're not a senior, they try to let those seniors get those starting reps. Lucas Van Ness played a ton, just never started a game. So physical freak, tested out of the world at the combine, young guy. So he kind of fits that mold of all the athletic traits to be successful, just needs more experience.
Yeah, and again, that position is one that we talked about a little bit last week.
Sure.
To me, it's tight end, cornerback, defensive line, pass rush help, something in some capacity, some interchangeable thing. So first round draft pick, I'm not on board the offensive line help at number 1 like some people are. Again, maybe if, the Skoronski or Broderick Jones, somebody like that drops, like we talked last week. But other than that, if those guys come off the board, I don't think offensive tackle, offensive guard, anything like that is where you go with that number 1 pick. Those 3 positions I said, premium positions, and defensive line would probably be right along cornerback with that massively premium position. And if you get a guy like Van Ness, I mean, he's almost like a Trayvon Walker type.
Ceiling's way up there.
Exactly. Yeah, Iowa guys. So I mean, you've got a guy who has a high ceiling, may take a year or 2 to develop, a la Trayvon Walker. But again, the upside, I think you get more of a raw prospect in Lucas Van Ness than you do with like a Brian Breesy kind of guy. You make this assumption and comparison all the time. We've talked about this even outside of work. But Trayvon Walker, Aiden Hutchinson, there's a high ceiling on Aiden Hutchinson, but
Right.
you kind of know where that ceiling ends. You know, he could be a 10-sack every other year kind of guy. But Trayvon Walker, while a little bit more raw, a little bit more refinement needed in his game, could be that 14, 15 sack a year, just guy who draws those double teams all the time. So again, you're like a Breesy Van Ness situation. Lucas Van Ness, obviously going to take some time to develop, going to probably need to add some explosiveness, some weight, some strength to get in that rotation. But again, you're playing for the future. I mean, Josh Allen, 5th-year option, Trayvon Walker still developing. So pass rush, I don't know if I would go Lucas Van Ness with that number 1 pick, but it makes sense.
No, I like the Van Ness pick. I think he has all the physical trades to be successful in the league, and he's the kind of guy, he's very similar. Not as a similar kind of build to a Trayvon Walker, but his game as far as being a raw, athletic power rusher, it fits. So I could 100% see this being the pick. I think that would bolster that pass rush. If Van Ness is there, I think there has to be a conversation. That hadn't been a scenario that we had discussed much because the expectation was that Lucas Van Ness would be gone higher in the draft than this point. So if Mel Kiper's hurt enough that maybe he thinks that Lucas Van Ness slides a little bit, that could be good for the Jaguars. I like the pick. Young guy, athletic marvel. He'll walk in the door looking like Thor. You know, and so it'll work out. I know you're a little upset with it because he passed on Michael Mayer to take
He
Lucas
goes
Van
a couple
Ness.
picks after that, though, fellas. So he goes a couple picks after that to the Cowboys. So, no, hey, man, Michael Mayer's still in play the first round. But I would not be opposed to a defensive line help because, again, to me, I think tight end, cornerback, defensive line, pass rusher, whatever. Those 3 positions are my number 1, 2, and 3. Again, and whatever Yahtzee kind of thing you want to do that, I think you have to address one of those 3 positions with that number 24 pick. Van Ness, would he be a bad pick? I don't think so. No. I just think you're going to need a little bit of patience with him, like Trayvon Walker. But I look back and I look back to early 2000s when Jacksonville was in a situation under Tom Coughlin. They're like, we want to have the best defensive line, absolutely best defensive line possible. What they do in back-to-back drafts? John Henderson, Marcus Stroud.
Right.
And you know what? That worked out pretty darn well.
Yeah.
That worked out pretty darn well.
And that's what you have to do. And the good thing is, if you draft an edge player like a Lucas Van Ness at that first-round pick, realistically, they come in this season and they're your 3rd pass rusher. They're your 3rd end. If the Jaguars play more 4-3 and nickel the way they did last year, they had 4 down linemen, Van Ness is your 3rd guy. That's not exactly putting the weight of the world on his shoulders. Like Trayvon walked in and he's a starter every down, played like 70 to 80% of the snaps until he got hurt. I mean, he was the guy. Lucas Van Ness doesn't have that sort of weight put on him. He gets to come in. He's going to largely play probably pass rush downs kind of things when they slide Trayvon in, different if that worked out that way. So he'd be in a little bit of a situation where he does have time to grow while still getting playing reps. And then the Jaguars would also have the decision to make with Josh Allen in the final year of his contract. Now, do you decide that Lucas Van Ness is the heir apparent? Or do you hand Josh Allen a big old extension and say, stay in Jacksonville and we've got our three-headed monster of pass rushers? Good problems to have because that way you at least have a solution in-house if you make that decision.
Absolutely.
All right.
And building off of that, I mean, Dwan Smoot, again, Lucas Van Ness could be that. Look at how well Dwan Smoot played last year with situational. He was not a starter. He was a situational player and delivered. So, you look at Dwan Smoot, he's not re-signed, coming off that Achilles. You add a Lucas Van Ness in there, you're obviously expecting him to come in, and he's not going to be a backup this year if you take him in the first round. He's going to play some instrumental minutes. So you've got to look at him. Okay, if Dwan Smoot's not in the equation, I know you signed some guys in free agency, some stopgaps. But again, if you get a Lucas Van Ness, if that's Mel Kiper's pick for the Jaguars, I'm not horribly disappointed in that at all. I think it addresses more of a future need than a present one, but I think he could come in and be that Dwan Smoot kind of rotational player as a rookie. And again, you bring him along, and then 2024, when you're faced with the Josh Allen situation, the Trayvon Walker's entering his 3rd year, I think you're sitting in a little bit better position. If you do decide to let Josh Allen walk after a $100 million contract you're not matching, then I think a Lucas Van Ness squeezing in there. Yeah,
it's possible there. And we've talked about them not necessarily upgrading positions. If you say Lucas Van Ness is your Arden Key, I don't think you're going to get very many arguments that Van Ness should be an upgrade over that role in your defense. All right, in the 2nd round, Mel Kiper has the Jaguars getting what I would say is a pretty good steal there with Cam Smith. Cam Smith, the cornerback from South Carolina. Cam had been talked about at one point as maybe the top cornerback in this year's draft class. He definitely has the mentality that I like. You go watch the quote from after that Tennessee game. I'll let you look that one up on Twitter. But look, Cam Smith can be a guy.
Yep.
And the only question mark that they kind of had with him was maybe the athletic ability and where his ceiling was as a player. But good mentality,
yep.
good cornerback. And if you get him in the second round.
Yep. I mean, we've talked about him, and mock drafts have had him even as a guy going to 24 for
right.
Jacksonville. So
right.
I know we've talked about him many times on the podcast, and I do think, again, that's a guy who fits in Jacksonville. Probably as a nickel corner this year. But again, I don't think that's a bad move either.
No.
I'm not opposed to either Mel Kiper's picks. Again, I've seen mock drafts from the ESPN guys where you're talking offensive tackle. First round, not a fan of that. I'm more fan, tight end, you know my affinity for Michael Mayer. Yeah. I know you hate it. Cornerback and also pass rush help, whether that comes in the form of a tackle inside or an edge rusher. You've got to address those three positions. One of those positions has to be at number 24.
Right, and I think I really like what Mel Kiper did in round 1 and round 2 here.
Yeah.
I like the combination of Van Ness and Cam Smith walking away in the first 2 rounds, and then you say, okay, in the third round, we double back. We can kind of reevaluate, hit that tight end position, maybe with a Sam Laporta kind of guy, go back to that Iowa well, or you start building that offensive line depth there. Because there are some guards. There's a guy from TCU I really like. His name's escaping me at this very moment, but he should be around in the third round. Another guy that
best player of the Jaguars rookie class last year, third round pick, Luke Fortner. Again, there are guys in there that can come in and plug and play kind of guys. If you're getting a guard in the third round, that's the expectation. You're going to come in and compete for that spot. I mean, Luke Fortner was he was instant starter.
He was an instant starter. It was never a conversation.
Yeah, as a day 3 pick.
I know there have been reports that the Jaguars really like McClendon Curtis, a guard tackle kind of guy out of Chattanooga. Interesting story. I actually covered McClendon Curtis in Chattanooga. I was at his signing day.
Wow.
He went to Chattanooga Central. He was a Purple Pounder. Really nice kid, great family. And he had offers to go to bigger schools and decided he wanted to go to Chattanooga because he said he wanted to be able to bring the hometown out to games and kind of help build that program. So he would be. I've seen him play for years. He's a good player. I think he could fit definitely at guard or that right tackle spot. But the best thing is the versatility. If they could get him in the 5th or 6th round, you bring in a guy who can play both guard and tackle. That's perfect when you start saying your game day activation, because now you can fill both roles for you. And maybe down the line he becomes a starter.
And they need a swing tackle.
And that's the type of thing they need.
And again, I know they've got Josh Wells in free agency, but again, you've got to have draft and develop. Trent Baalke, Doug Peterson swear by it. That's the way to do it in the NFL. If you can get a guy like that, a draft and develop, a swing tackle guy. I mean, Juwan Taylor, perfect example. You get him in the second round, you develop him. Would have been great to bring him back. But again, that's how Jacksonville needs to survive, and that's what Trent Baalke said after the season. That's the blueprint for how an NFL team should be run. Draft and develop, draft and develop. It'll be interesting to see if those last year draft picks, the Chad Mumas, the Devin Lloyds, take that development and take that next step. So, yeah, McClendon Curtis, hey, good. Bring him in here and let him bring that swing tackle.
Yeah, I think he could definitely fill that role. Okay, one other late round guy that I want to talk about that he at least came for a visit, and I think it'd be fun to think about. Tyjae Spears, running back from Tulane. I don't know if have you seen any of his stuff?
You talked about him a few weeks ago.
We talked about him a few weeks ago. He came to a visit in Jacksonville, and one of the things that we kind of talked about last week was my hang up of you want to put as many offensive weapons on the field with Trevor Lawrence and around him and say, you know what? We can rotate these guys in and out. One guy gets hurt, it's not a problem. We got another weapon to throw out there. But at the same time, you have to put big resources into building your offense. So a guy like Tyjae Spears, he does have some red flags. He's not the biggest running back in the world. He's coming from a smaller school. He's not going to go early just because of positional value as well. So you probably get him in the 4th or 5th round, similar to value to what you spent on Stoop Connor last year. But Tyjae Spears is a much more dynamic player. I mean, that's a guy that you start talking about if something happened to Travis Etienne and you have to put Tyjae out there, I mean, either one of them could go 90 like that. I mean, that would be fun.
Yeah, and the Snoop Connor pick last year was a little bit of a surprise for me. And maybe they saw the James Robinson transaction happening at some point. He was a J-Rob to me, that kind of guy where you didn't have that explosiveness. He's almost a enhanced fullback kind of guy, a straight ahead runner, and they need that. Obviously, Jacksonville needs that in those 4th and 1 situations where
which I think
they're not running
Johnson
a jet sweep
can
to
do
Travis
that now.
Etienne.
I think Dearness Johnson will be able to do some of that.
Okay, the free agent guy.
The free agent
from
guy
the
they
Browns.
brought in, yeah. I think he'll be able to fill a little bit of that role.
But again, running back is a position in the draft. If you look at draft needs for the Jaguars, running back always pops up on there. Sure. Always pops up on there. And I know you've talked about the running backs. There's another running back you mentioned a few weeks ago as well. His name is slipping my mind right now. I cannot remember his name, but you brought him up and you were a fan of.
Hey, I like some of the running backs in this class. I think there are a few running backs that will be available late that would make sense. If they're interested in Tyjae Spears, like I just think about Press Taylor and Doug Peterson's affinity for certain things, and I say, man, they get a guy like Tyjae out there, and they're like, oh, we got him and Etienne? Man, the fun they could have designing some of those plays. I mean, when you start thinking about some of the touches that they designed for Jamal Agnew, you just start throwing more players with those very niche but dynamic traits together, and you let Doug Peterson and Press Taylor go to the whiteboard and come up with something.
Like a tight end package with Michael Mayer and Evan Ingram. That's what you want to say.
That's what Doug Peterson might like that.
It makes sense. It makes sense.
It does. He is a player that does make sense for the Jaguars. He's just not a player that I'm prepared for them to take in the first
24.
round. At 24.
That's
if they
totally
trade
fair.
back. If they trade back to, even if they trade back to like that 31st pick, like the last pick in the first round this year, because the Dolphins forfeited. I know there are 32 teams. I got you. But if they traded back a little bit, even traded back to the top of the 2nd round, just for whatever reason some team wanted to move up, and Michael Mayer's there, then we can have this conversation. I like him there.
Getting him on board.
You can get him on board. I'm not getting on board at 24. I just can't do it there. In the 2nd round, I could get on board. I'm not on board with any of the tight ends at 24, to be 100% honest with you. Dalton Kincaid, I like him as a player. Don't like him at 24.
Right.
Darnell Washington, I keep trying to sell myself on this guy.
Not at 24.
Not at 24.
Not at 24.
In the 2nd round, if they traded back and picked up an extra pick or something like that, I could 100% get on board with the tight end.
And
with the way the draft is stacked, though, not at 24.
Yeah, and you hit the nail on the head last week and talked about the tight end class, and you're going to have options in the 3rd round for tight ends. So that totally makes sense. I don't know if you have a guy like Michael Mayer in the 3rd round, but I don't think Michael Mayer would be a bad pick at 24. Am I sold 100% on Michael Mayer? No. I think any of those 3 positions. But again, to your point last week about the depth of tight end in this class, we've seen it in recent years with receivers and guys dropping past that 1st and 2nd round. You have good picks. I think tight end is a position this year where you're going to be able to get a good tight end, Will Mallory in the 3rd round, the 4th round, and really have that Darnell Washington. He's not a 1st-round pick, but, he could be there in round 2, round 3 to add that. So they will go tight end on 1st or 2nd day.
Yeah, at some point in the draft, they will go tight end.
They will go tight end.
They have to. Will it be one of these top guys? I'm not sure. I have to think that Doug Peterson's looking at Darnell Washington and has to be having just like little sugar plums dancing in his head thinking about the things he'd be able to do. Like, okay, we're going to run the ball, having block, and then this 270-pound guy that can run a 4.6 just takes off up the scene, and the next thing you know, he's matched up on like a 5'10" slot corner, and they're like, throw it up,
Again, he's a Trayvon Walker type, though, where you're going to have to. He's
raw
as can be.
It's going to take time.
He is, man, he looks good,
but he's
a
physical freak.
He is a monster.
And you know what? The one thing that reason I've tried to sell myself more on Darnell Washington is really his size, because when I look at the Jaguars offense, and one of the things that we kind of talk about when we look at the wide receiver room or just the pass catchers room in general is it's almost like a basketball team.
Very small, quick guards.
They got a lot of guards. They might have like a one forward, but they don't have a center. If I'm looking at the Jaguars pass catchers right now, the closest thing they have to a center is Seth Williams, who was on the practice squad last year. He's a big guy who can go up and take it off the top shelf, but outside of that,
there's nobody. Chris Manhertz was the guy.
Marvin Jones was their top shelf guy.
Marvin Jones, but from a tight end perspective,
there's
nobody. There's nobody there. So Luke Farrell, Evan Ingram's more of that converted receiver kind of hybrid role. There's just not that girth right
Christian
there.
Kirk's a slot. Calvin Ridley's got some size and plays the outside, but I still wouldn't say that he's a top shelf kind of player. And you need that center. You need that post-up guy who can go up and take it off the top shelf in the kitchen kind of player. And I don't know who that 50-50 ball winner is on the roster right now. Darnell Washington at 6'7", 6'8", running that kind of speed, that kind of size. He's that kind of guy where you need, all right, well, nobody's open, toss it up.
Right.
Kind of player where you know at the very least with his kind of wingspan, more than likely the DB's not coming down with it either. It's either him or nobody. So it'll be interesting to see how they approach that, because I know that's something that the coaching staff has to be looking at.
Right.
Is where do you get that post kind of player from, and whether they view maybe a Calvin Ridley as more of that than maybe the rest of us do.
Yeah, he's only 6'1", though.
But he's only 6'1".
He's not a big guy.
They don't have that.
It's just when I think of that, just that big, hulking, strong wideout who's going to wrestle a ball down. I mean, DK Metcalf, kind of guy like that. I mean,
well, he's 101.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's true.
I mean, you might do better saying DeAndre Hopkins than DK.
Yeah, I mean, you need a guy. To me,
Yeah.
You beat this horse over and over and over. Where is that 6'4" alpha who's just going to wrestle that ball away, and you throw that jump ball in the end zone, those corner fade in the end zone, he's going to be out jumping a 6'2" corner. I mean, where is that guy? And he's not on the roster. Chris Manhurts was that big-bodied pass catcher. He's gone. You don't have that guy. Evan Ingram's more of a slight tight end.
Yeah.
You just don't have that guy. And, I think Calvin Ridley, will play like that.
Sure.
But you're just not going to have the measurables on those guys. And they need a guy. They need a Darnell Washington, just a monster. He'd be great, second, third round.
Yeah, if they can get him late, that would be perfect. And the one thing to keep an eye on is in the draft with the wide receiver class, a lot of the wide receivers on the shorter side. One of the few, probably the first tall receiver outside of Quentin Johnston, who's going to be the first receiver drafted, probably the second receiver drafted. The only other one is like A.T. Perry, who could go in the second or all the way down in the fourth because he's got issues. Quentin Johnston could be a questionable kind of guy, but who knows? I think there are options on the table. This should be fun. We'll keep talking more about this in our next episode of the News4JAGs podcast as we kind of gear up for the draft. We'll start to fine-tune that list. We'll even do probably our own full-on mock draft for one of these episodes, take you all the way from 1 till the end of the first round, maybe even do a couple more rounds for the Jaguars. But we'll have plenty of coverage for you. Make sure you subscribe, follow along, and you can find more of our coverage over on News4JAGs.com. But that'll do it for the episode, and we'll see you for next time.